I used to think my biggest problem in life was whether my lawn was exactly 2.5 inches tall or if my trash can stayed out 5 minutes past the pickup window. But man, was I wrong. You see, when the Coast Guard calls you at 2 in the morning while you're still half asleep and jet lagged from flight across the country, asking why your 40-foot cabin cruiser is currently 5 miles out at sea with a dozen intoxicated people dancing on the flybridge, you don't just wake up, you feel your soul leave your body. I was sitting on the edge of my bed in my dark bedroom, blinking at the phone, and for a second, I honestly thought it was a prank call from one of my old college buddies, but the voice on the other end was too professional, too cold, and had that distinct authority that only someone in uniform carries. They told me my vessel, the Blue Horizon, had just been boarded for operating without navigation lights, unlicensed alcohol distribution, and a total lack of safety equipment. And the officer's voice dropped an octave when he said that not a single person on board had a boating license or any clue how to pilot craft of that size. I threw on whatever clothes were on the floor, grabbed my keys, and drove to the marina with my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird because I knew for a fact I'd double-locked the cabin and the dock gate before I left for my business trip. When I pulled into the North Cove Marina, the scene was like something out of a bad action movie, with red and blue strobe lights reflecting off the water and painting the white hull of my boat in rhythmic pulses of emergency color. I saw my boat tied up at the fuel dock, looking like a disaster zone with discarded plastic cups and glitter scattered across the deck. And then I saw her, Eleanor Vance. Now, if you live in a coastal community, you know the type. Eleanor was the president of the Osprey Point Homeowners Association, a woman who treated our neighborhood like her own personal fiefdom and looked like she'd been born with a permanent scowl and a clipboard attached to her arm. She was standing there on the dock, wrapped in a pashmina scarf that probably cost more than my first car, looking absolutely indignant that the government was interrupting her evening. When I walked up, still breathless, and told the officers that I was the owner and I hadn't authorized a soul to touch my boat, Eleanor didn't even flinch. She just turned to me with this patronizing little smile, the kind you'd give a toddler who's confused about how gravity works. She actually had the nerve to tell me that since the community clubhouse was closed for, and quote, routine maintenance, and quote, the board had decided to utilize, and quote, underused neighborhood assets, and quote, for the annual Founders Day soiree, and since I was out of town, they figured I wooed into oppos, T-Mind contributing to the, and quote, greater good, and quote, of the association. I stood there, staring at her, and for a moment, I was actually speechless because the level of delusion required to believe you can just commandeer a private vessel is astronomical. I told her, right in front of the officers, that there is no, and quote, greater good, and quote, that involves breaking into a locked cabin and taking a $100,000 boat out into federal waters without a license. She just waved her hand like she was swatting a fly and said, and quote, oh, Arthur, Don and Oppos. TB's so dramatic. The HOA bylaws clearly state we have an easement for all maritime structures within the boundary, end quote, which was a complete and utter lie she'd fabricated on the spot. But the look on her face changed when the lead officer stepped in and informed her that, end quote, easements, end quote, Don and Oppos. T cover grand theft boat with a laundry list of maritime violations they were currently writing up. I didn't in Oppos. T wait for her to apologize. I knew she wooed into oppos. T. So I looked that officer in the eye and told him I wanted to press every single charge available in the book. And then I went home, not to sleep, but to pull up my doc's hidden security footage that Eleanor didn't into oppos. T know existed. What I found on those tapes over the next few hours made my blood run cold because it wasn't in oppos. T just a party, it was a coordinated invasion. I watched the footage from 3 days prior and saw Eleanor, along with the HOA treasurer, a slimy guy named Marcus, walking down my private ramp. She didn't into oppos. T struggled with the lock. She pulled out a master key that she must have skimmed from the marina's management office, and they spent hours prepping my boat, as if it were a rental. But the most chilling part was seeing them manually disable my onboard GPS and the internal cabin sensors, or at least they thought they did, because they didn't in oppos. T realized the system had a secondary backup that recorded every movement. On the night of the party, the footage showed them ushering on people I'd never seen before. Not neighbors, but men in expensive suits and women with heavy jewelry. and I saw Eleanor handing out thick envelopes to a couple of these guys, envelopes that definitely didn't end oppos. T contain, in quote, founders and oppos, day, in quote, invitations. It felt less like a neighborhood gathering and more like a high-stakes meeting, and that was the moment I realized I was in oppos. T just dealing with a bossy neighbor. I was looking at something that smelled like a criminal enterprise. The next morning, I was at the precinct meeting with a detective named Vance. Ironic name, I know, who looked like he'd spent 20 years dealing with people who thought they were above the law. He looked at my deed, my slip agreement, and then the footage I brought in, and he just whistled low, telling me that the dock was and oppos. T even HOA property, it was in quote. Fee simple in quote. Ownership, meaning Eleanor had zero jurisdiction. But then he pointed at the screen, at the men receiving the envelopes, and his face went serious, asking me if I knew who they were. When I told him I didn't in oppos, he informed me that one of them was a known developer who'd been trying to get a controversial dredging permit passed through our local wetlands for years, a permit the community had been fighting tooth and nail. Suddenly, the end quote, founders and oppos, day soiree in quote, made sense. Eleanor was an end oppos. T just throwing a party. She was using my boat as a bribe mobile, a private in quote, secure in quote, location to broker a deal that would destroy our coastline, all while charging the end quote, event costs in quote, back to our own HOA dues. I decided then that I wasn't into oppos. T gonna just play defense. I was gonna burn her little empire to the ground, so I started digging through the HOA and oppos. As digital archives, using a loophole in our state law that allows any member to audit the books with 48 hours in oppos notice. I stayed up for 2 days straight, fueled by coffee and spite, tracing a trail of, in quote, landscaping fees, in quote, and in quote, legal retainers, in quote, that led straight to a shell company registered in Nevada under Eleanor's maiden name. She'd been skimming off the top for 5 years, nearly $4 million in total, all while fine-tuning our lives and making us feel guilty for having the wrong shade of curtains. By the time I called for an emergency board meeting, I didn't in oppos. T just have 10% of the neighborhood behind me. I had 50% because word had gotten out that I wasn't in oppos. T the only one she'd, in quote, borrowed, in quote, from. She'd been using the neighborhood's emergency fund to pay for her daughter's equestrian lessons, disguised as, in quote, drainage repair, end quote. The night of the meeting was electric. The air in the community hall was thick with the scent of cheap coffee and pure, unadulterated rage. Eleanor tried to walk in like she still owned the place. Chin up, pearls on, but when she saw the federal agents standing at the back of the room next to Detective Vance, she finally, for the first time, looked small. I stood up and didn't in oppos. To give a speech, I just projected the footage of her on my boat, followed by the bank statements showing the money trail, and the silence in that room was so heavy you could have heard pin drop. She tried to scream that it was quote, coordinated character assassination, end quote. But her voice cracked, and when Marcus, the treasurer, saw the handcuffs on the detective's belt, he didn't end oppos to even hesitate. He pointed his finger right at her and shouted that it was all her idea. The vote to remove her took less than 60 seconds, and as she was escorted out of the building to a chorus of boos and some very colorful language from a 90-year-old woman in the front row, I realized that the blue horizon wasn't end oppos. T just a boat anymore. It was the thing that sank a tyrant. It took months to get the boat back to its original state. The repairs were extensive because someone had apparently tried to use the bilge as a cooler for champagne and ended up blowing a pump. But every time I look at the new helm screen, I don an oppos. T feel angry anymore. I feel a sense of peace because the neighborhood changed after that. The gates are still there, but the fear is gone, and we actually talk to each other now instead of just checking for violations. Eleanor is currently serving time for wire fraud and grand theft, and her, in quote, wellness retreat, in quote, turned out to be a very drab federal facility where they donned oppos. T served mimosas on the deck. But looking back, I still wonder, how many other people are living under the thumb of someone like her, too afraid to ask where their money is going or who's, in quote, borrowing, in quote, their property when they aren't in oppos. T looking? I got lucky because I had a camera and a boat that someone decided to take for a joyride, but it makes you think, Do you really know what an oppos is happening in your neighborhood when you turn the lights out? Or is your community leader just waiting for you to leave town so they can unlock your gate? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. Have you ever had a run-in with an HOA that went way beyond petty or do you think I was too hard on her for what she called a misunderstanding Let's talk about it because I have a feeling I'm not the only one with a story like this.